Hello Internet. This video is going to be about what Linux distribution to choose. Now, I've done something similar in the past with Windows Refugees. It's about the programs and applications, but that's more about where to go in terms of what programs you can use when you actually go to Linux. But what about choosing the distribution? Well, frankly, there's a large number of ways of doing this selection. So let me just pull up a picture here. This is the one I wanted. So this is Linux. And this is actually a small diagram. There's actually larger diagrams out there. But basically, Linux has multiple versions, multiple distributions, multiple forks. So, how do you decide between all of these? That's the question that faces Windows refugees when they come to Linux. So, originally there was Unix, and then GNU tried to make similar software, but that was free, and you came along with GNU and the Linux kernel. And as time passes, the projects fork off of one another, although they all pretty much still come back to a lot of the same software components. Some don't. But this is daunting for anyone to look at. So just out of curiosity, what were the few original forks? Well, we have Debian. Pretty much everybody's heard of that. Yopper. Probably nobody's heard of that. We have Puppy. We have Kate Linux. We have Sorcerer. Tamu, MCC Interim, Slackware, SUSE, Jurix, Enoch, Stampede, Yggdrasil, Crux, Rock, Linux from Scratch, Dynebolic, LST, DLD, Delix, Red Hat. And then it forks more and more as you go along. So here we have CentOS, Scientific. These are just some of the names that I'm picking up that I recognize. We have Arch, OpenSUSE, Exandros, Knoppix, Damn Small Linux, Ubuntu and its derivatives, Linspire, FreeSpire, LibreNet, Storm. And then if we actually get out of that and we look at just simply Red Hat, even Red Hat itself is forked. Some of the more recognizable ones here are PC Linux OS, Mageia, Oracle Enterprise, Fedora Core, a bunch of others I've never heard of, and Linux PPC. And there have even been websites dedicated to choosing, although many of them have disappeared. So there's various sites out there like this, where you run a little test and you answer questions as to how you want to select your distribution. And this one starts with the software use case. Do you want it for daily use? Do you want to do anonymous web browsing? Do you want to do it for data rescue? Do you want it supported by game publishers? And for scientific purposes. And then you make your answer and you proceed. And it continues on into computer knowledge, Linux knowledge, installation presets, etc., etc., hardware, price, scope, etc. Now this isn't exactly how I would put the hierarchy of needs in regards to this. I would personally start with, what hardware do you have? What computer do you have that you want to put Linux on? Do you have an ancient piece of machinery from the DOS and Windows 3.1 days? Do you have a piece of hardware from the Windows 95, 98 days? Or from the Windows 2000 XP ME days? From the Windows 7 era? From the Windows 10 era? And if you don't like defining it in terms of what Windows version do you have, you could set it up in terms of what processor do you have and how much RAM do you have? What size hard drive do you have? Because those questions are going to limit you more than anything else in terms of what distribution you're going to go for. And only after you kind of realize your hardware limitations, after that you should define your needs. What are you actually going to use your computer for? Now this is a question that most computer owners have never actually asked themselves. And this distro chooser website, for instance, starts with a question, have you got experience with Linux? Do you really want to change your operating system if you don't have any experience with Linux? Well, if you don't, then they might recommend you considering virtual boxes, Windows 7, Mac OS, and a further question of does it need to look like Windows, and then it recommends a couple of Linux versions based on it looking like Windows. And then of course if you have experience with Linux, it then asks do you need it to be Unix-like, yes and no, and then starts giving you various recommendations. And then if it's free or paid, and then you start going off into the wilds of other questions, eventually getting down to questions of more specific requirements. So for instance, if you need it to be free and you want it to be research Unix-like, you might end up here at Minix or Darwin. But let's take a look at this one and see what it would take to get to let's say Puppy Linux. Let's see, is Puppy Linux in here? Okay, Puppy Linux is down here. So it is first under old or current gen computer. Well, current, they want you to go to Ubuntu. If it's older, Xubuntu. If it's even older than that, Lubuntu. If it's even older than that, Puppy Linux. Okay, so the age of the computer is actually where I would start, not one of the finalizing questions. Ease of use might be a second one, so I would kind of do this tree kind of in reverse almost. Do you like minimalism? Do you want to compile packages from source? Desktop or netbook? General purpose or specifically oriented? Do you care about freedom? Everyday use? Is it free? Is it Unix-like? Well, being Unix-like is a question I would probably never even consider if I were ending up at Puppy Linux. I'd probably be going, my machine is from the era of DOS and Windows 95, therefore my two choices would probably be Damn Small Linux or Puppy Linux or Crunchbang or TinyCore or the other successor to Crunchbang, which I forget right now. Okay, I just looked it up. It's called Brunson Labs. And there's a few others, one called Crunchbang Plus. And Brunson Labs looks quite a lot like Crunchbang, where you just right-click and you get your menus. Very, very minimal. And you'll notice everything they're showing you here is pretty much a wallpaper. Because when it comes to Crunchbang, it's literally the program that you're interested in. So instead of showing you LibreOffice, they're showing you pictures of desktop wallpaper. Because there's so little to it, in order to keep it so small that it does just what you need to do and run the specific software you need to run. But these are great little distributions for less powerful computers. But anyway, where I would start after the hardware you have is I would start with, do you want to be reinstalling your operating system distribution, or do you want to simply run an upgrade? So say for instance you're on Ubuntu. Well, Ubuntu was never meant to run as an upgrade. It was meant to be done as a reinstall. But that doesn't mean with that particular distribution that you can't do an upgrade. They do come out with little programs that will run and upgrade your system. They're not always successful, however. And if you're more than one version behind, they're less and less likely to be successful. That's because Ubuntu was designed from the get-go to be a distribution that when you wanted to upgrade, you had to reinstall. Whereas other distributions were always designed from the beginning to update and never reinstall. Not unless something goes terribly, terribly wrong. The next question I would go to would be free and open source. Well, what is free and open source? It's software that can be classified as both free and open source. Anyone can license it. They can use it, copy it, change the software in any way. The source code's there. They can open it up, make modifications, and redistribute it. Whereas there's other software where it may be available for free, as in you don't have to pay for it, but it's closed. You are not allowed to go into it, copy the code, and make modifications, and then redistribute it as something of your own. And that distinction, free and open source and not free and open source, is probably the #1 divide in Linux in terms of the software that you are going to use. Not just at the operating system level or the desktop environment level, but in terms of the specific applications that you're going to be running. And that's pretty much something that you really don't see much of if you're coming from, let's say, a Windows background. Yes, Windows does have shareware and freeware and stuff like that, but it's a very tiny, tiny, tiny component of the software that's run on Windows machines. Whereas on Linux, it can be the vast majority of the software that you are running. So after that question of, or those questions of defining your needs, reinstall versus upgrade, and strictly FOSS or not, I would come down to the identity politics pro-communism question. Because the Linux kernel has adopted a code of conduct. Previously, the Linux kernel operated on not a code of conduct, but a code of conflict. The best software won. The best code won. Now they're bringing in identity politics. And this is being brought in by the Linux Foundation, which has been taken over by money. And this may be the next great schism to affect the GNU Linux community. Right now it really hasn't amounted to much of anything at all, but in the future it probably will. So right now, if you are running GNU software, you have a choice of either the Linux kernel or the herd kernel. There's a few other kernels that are kind of experimental out there that you can try, but herd and Linux are the two big ones, and herd has been under development since forever and still doesn't have a first beta out. That's because Linux beat them to the punch. And you kind of need to realize what the kernel is. The kernel talks to the hardware. Whereas most of the stuff that you think of as a layperson as to what is the operating system is actually GNU software. Now, after the politics of this, the next thing that you would really need to look at is the desktop environment. Some desktops are heavy on system resources and others are very light on system resources. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this is a really good article that is up on the Renewable PCs website, and basically it just lists the various desktop environments and what they require. So what is a desktop environment? Well, it's an implementation of the desktop metaphor made of a bundle of programs. So basically it's a bundle of programs running on top of a computer operating system, which share a common graphical user interface, sometimes described as a graphical shell. Brian Lunduk has a little slideshow here. So for instance, the Mac OS desktop environment was Lisa. One of the first ones for DOS was Gem. For Commodore, with their Commodore Amiga, they had the Amiga Workbench desktop. And then Brian Lunduk goes into various other computer systems like the Arthur RISC OS, Acorn Computers, something most people probably wouldn't know about. And then there's OS2. Next step, again, something most people aren't going to know anything about. Then we get up to the Windows 95 DE. So lots of desktop environments out there. But let's just take a look. So we have GNOME. GNOME is kind of Macintosh-like. But its required RAM is almost a gig. And the CPU required is 400 megahertz. Unity, the original Ubuntu DE, required a gig RAM and a gig processor. So as you can see, Unity was a bit of a pig in comparison to GNOME. And then we have Cinnamon, Mince desktop environment, half as much as GNOME for CPU or for RAM required, and 2/3 of what was required for GNOME. But the CPU required is just as bad as for Unity. And we have Mate. Mate is less on the CPU, still the same amount of RAM as Cinnamon. And we have KDE. Okay, KDE is a little bit more on the RAM and still heavy on the CPU. Then we have XFCE, and look at these numbers drop. Only 200 megabytes of RAM and only a 300 megahertz CPU is required. So this is actually why I went with XFCE, very good numbers. Then you have LXDE, and again, even better numbers. 128 megabytes of RAM and a 266 megahertz CPU. So why didn't I go with LXDE? At the time I was choosing a distribution. LXDE was merging with Qt, and they were coming out with a new DE. So I didn't choose it because of that. I was waiting to see what they would come out with. Actually, I think I did install this distribution in one computer, and it's very similar to XFCE. Then we have Enlightenment. Look at this. 64 megabytes of RAM. 200 megahertz. One of the distributions that uses it, EFL and Bodhi Linux. A lot of people like Enlightenment. Enlightenment has actually been around for a while. If we go back to the Brian Lunduk page, well, it's not a Brian Lunduk page. What's the page actually called? itgovernment.computerworld.com, but it's an article, slideshow put together by Brian Lunduk. Enlightenment has been around since 1997. And then on this page we get into a more direct comparison of the numbers in terms of RAM and CPU used. And then it throws in a few other Windows managers. A Windows manager is sort of like a lightweight desktop environment. A desktop environment will be everything from the start menu to the icons on the desktop to the clock in the corner and the little applications like for sound and for your internet connectivity that might be down there in the tray, whereas a Windows manager is much less than that. So you have things like OpenBox, JWM, Fluxbox. I think 53 megabytes of RAM is the lightest that there is in the list. And when you're running it, the percentage of the CPU that it actually uses, 1 to 2%, 1 to 4%, 9 to 10%. Mate's kind of heavy. Cinnamon's up to 12%, kind of heavy. Up to 14% for Enlightenment. So the ones that are hitting like 1% or 1 to 2% are the lightest. And XFCE's right in there. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Oh, and another deciding factor for me for LXDE versus XFCE, I think it was the screensaver, the desktop wallpapers. One of them didn't have the ability to randomly change the wallpapers unless you wrote a script for it, and I think the other one did, or Cinnamon didn't. But the wallpaper and the screensaver ended up being one of the deciding factors. And then, of course, once you've chosen a desktop environment, some of those desktop environments can be customized even further. So let's see what it says down here. Docky allows the creation and customization of a Mac OS-like dock. Zorin OS has a nice feature called Look Changer, which allows users to change the normal GNOME desktop, or from desktops very similar to either Mac OS, Windows 7, or XP. But as you can see, the RAM and the CPU requirements, those numbers might be a very, very important factor depending on what hardware you have. If you only have 500 megabytes of RAM, you're not going to want to be running Unity. Okay, so the next thing I have on my list is bleeding edge repositories, or ancient and stable, or somewhere in between. Well, I did a video on this already. It's what is meant by stable, testing, and unstable. Where basically, if you use bleeding edge software, the latest versions of everything that's out there, you're much more likely to break something on your system. And unless you are more of a power user for Linux, you might be completely lost as to how to fix something when it breaks. Then again, some of the most stable repositories out there can completely lack anything that's new. And it's like you're using software from like 15 years ago. But the benefit of that is that if you need a computer to run one specific application in, let's say, a production environment where making money depends on that operating system being rock stable, that's something that you're going to want, because that one application is the only thing that you need to have up to date, and everything else just simply needs to not break anything. So again, this comes down to what are your needs. Now, this is actually becoming a little bit less relevant in the Linux world now that we have things like Flatpaks and app images. So it's sort of like a sandbox wrapper kind of thing. So if I want to run the latest version of, let's say, Blender, I can grab the app image, and everything that program needs to run is isolated inside its folder. So if there's a dependency that the rest of my system doesn't have, it'll be in that app image. And I don't have to install that dependency into the rest of my system, which might actually break other things. And Flatpaks do something similar. Not exactly the same, but something similar. So you can now get more up-to-date software without really worrying about the stability of your system. And if you want to get into the innards of desktop environments and the various components of a distribution, there's a couple of other videos I've made, bloody innards of Linux distributions and how they differ, and composition of a GNU Linux distribution. Now, once you've made those sorts of decisions, you get to make some rather esoteric sort of decisions. For instance, my machine is not a bare bones machine, but I was very, very tempted to run a distro that is meant for a bare bones machine called Puppy Linux. Now, I could do an entire video on Puppy Linux, and I might do that later, but it's originally created in 2003 as a smaller, leaner version of Vector Linux. The idea was to make a small, lean, yet compatible edition of Linux that was useful from the get-go. The download ISO contains all the standard applications to handle the usual computing needs: word processing, spreadsheets, web browser, etc. Another central idea was that the OS would work off as I think that's a bit of a typo in their sentence, but it would work off of a live CD or as a live CD, but with support for persistence. That is, to keep the data between the reboot sessions. So in other words, it's a live CD where you actually get to save your configuration. This way the live CD can be used as if it is a fully installed operating system. In other words, you could actually run this on a machine that had Windows on it without actually getting rid of Windows. However, if user data is corrupted in any way, in a flick of a switch, the persistence can be turned off and Puppy would boot in its pristine live CD state. In other words, if you put a file on, let's say, Windows, and some idiot deleted the file, the next time you boot, you're back up to running Puppy in its original unconfigured state. Size has always been a major consideration. Linux of these early days did not have good hardware support, thus Linux machines tend to be older and more obsolete computers with older CPUs and little RAM and storage. Also, broadband internet was not popular back then. Many users were still on dial-up, which limited download speeds to 3.8 kbps, kilobits per second. So conscious decisions were made to choose software components which provides the maximum functionality at a given size. Example, the choice of ROX Filer as the file manager. Another example would be using CMonkey for the web browser, because CMonkey is an HTML composer. It is a news client, aka news reader, and a web browser, and an email client. So it's 4 programs in one. So instead of loading 4 different programs into RAM, which would take up, say, let's just make up a number, let's say 300 megabytes, you're loading in one program which is taking up, let's say, 150 megabytes. Whereas if you simply loaded an email client, it might be 50 megabytes. Or if you simply loaded up an HTML editor, it might be 25 megabytes. But by having it all in one, it's less overhead than if you were to load all 4 of them at once. So decisions like that. Now, these machines, these older machines, may have very little RAM, but with the way Puppy is designed, it loads everything into RAM. So it's right there, right away, ready to use, fast, fast, fast. And of course, Puppy itself, being as unique as it is branching off into its own distributions. So as of version 5, there's 4 concurrent official Puppy releases and many other unofficial puppies, puplets. So you have Lucid Puppy. So it's built from Ubuntu packages. Worry Puppy is from Barry himself, the originator of Puppy Linux, and not as popular as the Lupo or Slacko Worry Puppy. Worry Puppy was offered as a direct upgrade to Puppy Linux 4.3.1 and was targeted for older computers. Part of why it's not as popular. And that's part of the major love for Puppy, is it lets you use really obsolete computers and keep them relevant. Slacko Puppy. I am reading these along with you here at home because I'm not as familiar with all the variations of Puppy. And I just can't be bothered to read it all first, write a script, and read it back to you. Popular due to its friendliness and incorporating a lot of community feedback. So it's for more modern hardware. Racy Puppy. Billed it as Wary on steroids and featured a PAE kernel and a later version of Xorg. And Precise Puppy. Built with Ubuntu binary compatibility. Let's see, and then we have Series 6. The originator Barry stepped down because the community effort was there to do so. And there are 2 Series 6 versions of Puppy. The first one is Tarpup, whose packages come from Ubuntu trusty Tahar. Tarpup started as a project to upgrade Lupo to make use of the newer Tahar packages. So it is the spiritual successor to Lupu. It was developed and maintained by Phil Broughton. The second one is Slacko Puppy, direct successor to Slacko 5.7. This release also marked Puppy's Linux move forward to support 64-bit machines. So if you got a more modern computer with 64-bit, you're probably going to go with Series 6, Slacko Puppy. And of course, previous Puppies have always been able to run 64-bit machines, but only in 32-bit mode. So both TarpUp and Slacko offer 64-bit editions, as well as the regular 32-bit editions. And then you have the Puplets, or community editions. And these are sort of like respins. And they can get into some really interesting variations. And I thought I'd just go to YouTube here for a minute and actually pull up some various Puppy Linux vids. And it can give you a bit of an idea what they look like. There's even some comparison videos like Lubuntu 15 versus Puppy 5.7. But let's just pop open one of these videos and mute. And we'll just bounce into some of the pictures of it. So you'll notice the start menu, much more condensed and sort of bare bones. It's all there. And if I go full screen, and if I zoom in here, let's see if I remember how to do that. Okay, I can't move my mouse when it's maximized, but anyway, you'll notice that in here for desktop, there's a bunch of things here that the names you probably wouldn't even recognize, kind of thing. That's part of the benefits and drawbacks, I guess, Puppy, where they use so many tiny programs. So yeah, here we are in the setup. So you have their own Puppy package manager, updates, but then you have something SFS, load on the fly. Most people aren't going to know what that is. And then you got a grub for DOS bootloader, and a legacy grub config. So there's lots of options there that is going to be new territory for most Linux users even. Let's go back a bit there. Okay, so in graphics we have GPIC, MT Paint, Inkscape Lite, PZ Glue Image Joiner, PZ Scale Graphic Resizer. So these are a bunch of programs that most people aren't going to be familiar with, because they're used to using bigger programs that require more overhead, and these options would be included in those packages, kind of thing. But with Puppy, they break a lot of the features of bigger programs into smaller packages that make them easier to run and load, kind of thing. Or instead of using GIMP, they use MT Paint image editor. Instead of using a full version of Inkscape, they use a lighter version of it. So you're going to get things like that happen in Puppy, simply to keep things smaller. But again, there are heavier versions of Puppy where you can get the full meal, kind of thing. But again, remember, Puppy was meant originally for older computers that barely had anything in terms of RAM and CPU. And you'll have things like here, Puppy Phone, Internet Telephone. When's the last time you saw a modern distribution of Linux that actually had dial-up? Right there in your system settings. But anyway, like I said, I'm just popping around for and here's a neat little quick picker, for instance. You can change your kernel that you're using. You can do that in pretty much any Linux distribution, but usually you have to go hunting for how and where to do it. So here, again, with this quick pet, you get the choice of your browser. You can do Firefox, SeaMonkey, Opera, Google Chrome, Vivaldi, Chromium, Tor, or Basilisk. But one of the original defaults was SeaMonkey. So Puppy is a rather interesting distribution. But it's one of the distributions that loads everything into RAM, and it's there. So as soon as you click on it, it's there. It's up, it's loaded, it's running. But it is an envelope-restricted sort of distribution, specifically because of the hardware. They're trying to give you the maximum usability on limited hardware. But that doesn't mean that you can't put a heavier version of Puppy on a really modern computer and have a great system. But Puppy is a universe in and of itself. Okay, so the next question in terms of distribution is going to be the curation. Do you want as much of the pre-installed software as possible on the distro? Distro. Or do you want to be the one to personally pick and choose what applications that you want to have on your system? Well, Cylon Linux. No, not this type of Cylon. The software kind. So the Cylon, or Ceylon operating system, has got all the bells and whistles that you could ever want, kind of thing. As it says, it comes with a massive collection of software, which aims to fill your daily digital needs. So it's meant to have the best tweaks, apps, and configurations available. So it's done all the hard work for you, including installations and configurations. And when we look at the technical details, it's partially open source, and it does contain non-free applications. And if we look at the minimum system requirements, they want a whopping 1.7 gigahertz processor and a minimum of 1 gig of RAM. And then here's their main program list. I'm just going to scroll down, and you can pause and read at your pleasure. So as you can see, a lot of software included from the get-go. This, of course, means lots of updates that run. So there may be a bunch of software on this that you don't use. For instance, LMMS, if I remember correctly, is a music maker. So if you're not into making music, this program is on your machine and it'll be running updates, or asking for updates when the updates become available, kind of thing. And if you don't have a webcam, well, there's a webcam program installed already that, again, is going to need updates when they become available. So when you do your standard update check, the updates for all of this software is going to be there. So instead of maybe 4 or 5 updates, you may have 12 to 15 updates. So that's what happens when you load your system down with a lot of software. Just more software needs updating. Now the opposite of a heavy system is a light system in terms of what is pre-installed. And I can't think of anything more light or non-installed than Arch, because Arch you literally build yourself. And as you can see, the web page for Arch is very minimal, almost no graphics, just the banner. And everything that's done for Arch is something that you do. So if you don't say you want a web browser, you don't get a web browser. And there are, of course, other distributions that are like this, but those are your two choices. You want something that is very curated and comes with as much pre-installed software as possible, or something that is absolutely bare bones and you decide, or do you want something that's a little bit more reasonable and in between? So there we are, about 44 minutes of complete ramblings on how to choose a Linux distribution. In the end, it comes down to what is your personal choice? What are your needs? So if you're just going to jump into Linux and start downloading various distributions until you find one that you might like, you might not have the best time of it. And that's because you're not defining what your needs are. What do you need your computer to do? What do you need your operating system to do? For instance, if the primary thing that you want your Linux system to do is play Windows-based games, you're going to be in for a bad time. Now, that isn't to say that Linux can't play Windows games or Windows software for that matter. You can using Wine. And with Steam and their new way of running Windows software, there's a lot more options than there used to be before. But Linux is not Windows. It's kind of like going to a Macintosh from an Atari setup and being pissed off and disappointed that you can't run your old favorite Atari games on your Macintosh. That's what it's like when you'd go from Windows to Linux and complain about not being able to run Windows software. So for me, choosing Linux distributions comes down to what hardware do I have? What machinery do I have that I'm going to be putting Linux on? And then you start going into your defining your needs, your method of upgrading or reinstall. Do you want to be strictly FOSS or not? Do I want to support the identity politics of the kernel? Do I want a desktop environment that's heavy on system resources, or do I want to go with a simple Windows manager that's very, very light? Do I want bleeding edge software, or do I want old and stable? Do I want something unique that loads directly into RAM, or that makes use of standardized hard drives, or that can run without a hard drive at all? Do I want a distribution that curates the software that's installed, or do I want to pick and choose that for myself? And then once you have an idea of those questions, then you can start digging into the distributions that exist. And you can ask the specific question of each distro that you look at and very quickly decide whether or not it's something you even want to bother to try, rather than grabbing everything, throwing it on a disk, booting it up, and checking it out. Then again, throwing everything onto an individual CD or DVD or USB stick and just simply trying it out, or trying it out in a virtual machine, is still a perfectly valid way of going through Linux and trying it out. But I suspect that most people are going to have better satisfaction if they answer some basic questions up front. Apologies for the very long video and rambling, but anyway, that's my opinion on how you should go about choosing a Linux distribution.